A 1, a 2, 1, 2, 3, 4. You can be serious or silly when you paint with Robin and Lily. Mama's a teacher, I just write songs. Come and join along.
Hi, I'm Robin.
And I'm Lily.
And we are
Robin and Lily.
For the Love of Painting. Thanks for joining us. This episode, we will be painting a beautiful daffodil.
I'm so excited that it's spring and that we can finally get into painting beautiful life that we see right in our front yard, even in our perennial garden.
Yep, we've got some beautiful daffodils in bloom right now. Ready to get started?
Yep, we're doing things a little differently today. If you've been following along with some of our past videos and kits, and you've purchased our kits, you'd find that we typically start with starter lines and not the full drawing already drawn out. This is a test today, so why don't you tell us whether or not you like to draw your own picture before we begin to paint, or if you'd rather start with the image already drawn for you and just do the painting on top of it.
Right, so each of our videos so far, we've had starter lines and we helped you finish the drawing. This particular kit comes with a simple line drawing that is complete and ready to paint. So yeah, let us know what you like, and we'll keep changing things and making things better as we go.
All right, so how do we start this time?
Okay, well, since we already have our drawing in place, of course there are some of you who won't be using a kit and won't be using our materials. That's great too. If you are joining us with your own paper, materials, paints, brushes, then you'll want to pause and maybe take a good close look at our image, but then do your own sketch, your own line drawing on your watercolor paper, and when you're ready, push play and we'll be ready to begin. Okay, so since we already have our drawing, we're going to start by painting in our background. You can see on our step-by-step postcard that step number 2 is the background. This is a beautiful cerulean blue. We're going to paint this background wet on wet. That means we're going to start with clean water. We're literally going to paint our paper with pure water and no paint or pigment to begin with. We're going to paint with pure water right up to the edge of our line drawing, all the way around. You'll want to take your time. Be careful along those lines that represent the edges of your drawing. The water will be painted right up to those lines, and then as we come out away from the drawing, we're going to leave just a pretty good area of wet paper. And then you'll see after we've painted in all of the water for the background, we're going to start adding drops of cerulean blue. We'll paint the blue right up to the edges and then let that pigment bleed and move on its own and spread throughout the wetness of the paper. That is painting wet on wet. It's one of our watercolor techniques. So let's get started. We're going to start with adding water to the background, and then we'll add our pigment. Okay, so we've completed painting in just plain water to make the background and our watercolor paper nice and wet. Now we're going to add a little water to our cerulean blue on our palette. Get that nice and moist.
So this time, once our brush has paint on it, we're going to use the other cup. You want one cup to just stay clean water, the other's for rinsing.
Okay. The darkest parts of our blue are going to be closest to the flowers and the leaves and the stems. So go ahead and start filling in these areas where your paper is wet and where the blue is filling in sort of the inner parts of that background in between each shape. You can just drop the color and watch it move and bleed, or you can move it around on the paper in the water with your brush. The really fun part is when you start getting out toward the edges of that wetness on the paper and you really let the paint do its own thing. Let it bleed, let it move, have fun with it. What's kind of amazing about painting wet on wet when you leave areas of your drawing dry is that the pigment and the wetness will stop when it hits the edge of the dry area. It's one way of having a lot of control while you're also letting the paint do its own thing and really not have any control. Beautiful. All right, now if we start to paint our daffodil with the background wet, all of that beautiful blue would be ruined by the yellows and the greens just bleeding right into it. So we need to either pause and just naturally wait and let our paper dry, or we could use a blow dryer to kind of speed up that drying process.
Okay, so all it took for us was 1 minute with a blow dryer, and now we're ready to keep going. I also noticed while I was using the blow dryer that I kind of moved my paint along the edge here and created a border around my flower. I didn't mean to do that, but apparently you can use the blow dryer as an actual technique as well. Or you could just let it sit and bleed and do its own thing, allowing it to dry by air over time.
That's right, and we are ready to begin painting our daffodil. We're going to use a technique called glazing, where we first paint our petals with just yellow. After that's completely dry, we'll go back and add layers of a yellow with a little of this alizarin crimson to give us an orange tint. And when you layer pigment and color on top of dry layers in the watercolor style, that's called glazing. And it really adds a richness to the color as you layer colors on top of each other. So let's paint our daffodils in just yellow, and then we'll go back with some glazing. I want to point out as we begin to paint our daffodil that although the background was painted wet on wet, now we're painting wet, a wet brush, on dry paper. So as we paint our petals in just yellow, we're using a wet on dry technique. We're going to push pause and let our daffodils dry. Okay, so now that our daffodil is dry, we're going to use that glazing technique that I mentioned a moment ago. So we're literally going to create a new color, just a slightly different pigment, and paint the entire daffodils again with a second layer of color that's going to add richness and variety, and that is our glazing. So let's give that a try. We're going to use clean water. I'm going to clean my brush first. Then I'm going to use clean water, and on my palette I'm going to pull over a little bit of yellow and a tiny bit of our alizarin crimson to give us a very faint orange.
Pretty. I like that.
I'm going to add a little bit more water to mine because I want it to be a really thin, faint orange. When you have the color that you like, go ahead and paint your daffodils again with that second layer. We're going to pause one more time and let our daffodils dry.
All right, and now that that layer of glaze is dry, we're gonna go back in with some shadow.
That's right. You can see step 3 on our postcard, which is included in our painting kits. It has us adding a bit of orange for the shadow areas. So think about where the petals touch one another or overlap. Any place in your drawing where the petals touch or overlap, that's going to create a little bit of a shadow. Also here in the center part of each center of the daffodil, as that color or shadow goes down in the center of our flower, that's going to be a darker area as well. So we're creating shadows with a little bit of orange. We're going to mix a little bit more of our alizarin crimson and our yellow. A little bit darker this time. Now, don't try too hard to be really specific and controlled with your shadows. You can even add a few more drops of water, and again, letting the shadow pigment bleed and move around a little bit. We don't want to keep our watercolor painting too controlled. I really fight with that all the time.
So I don't really know what I'm doing here when it comes to adding the shadow, but I do know where shadow typically falls. So using common sense, I'm moving my darker parts closer to the layers to where the petals overlap, like Mom said, on the inside. And then also thinking about a light source, I kind of chose my light source to come from this side. So you see that, choose the right side of my petals and such to be lighter than the flip side. So that's kind of how I chose to go about laying down my shadow.
Yeah, that's great. And I love that you made us think about the highlights. So where that light reflects and bounces off of each part of our flower. So the lighter yellow, or the edges of your petals, the lighter yellow would represent the reflection of light. Great, and it's looking beautiful, Lily.
Yeah, Mama, love it.
We don't want to forget that daffodils are actually typically yellow, and the orange is mostly shadow. I feel like I've added a little bit of too much orange, and I wanted to let you know that you can use your brush almost like an eraser while your paint is still wet on the paper. So I'm going to clean my brush really good and kind of dry it off a little bit. And you can go back into the areas that are still wet, and you can actually pick up pigment and wipe it off on the paper towel. So I'm going to bring my brush in and pick up a little bit of this orange, and you can see how much it picks up that paint, and then just wipe it off over here to expose more of my under layer of yellow and a little bit less orange. All right, our daffodils are looking beautiful. You might notice that the orange and the blue really pop. That's because they're complementary colors. They're across from one another on the color wheel. So anytime we use colors that are across from one another on the color wheel, Christmas is a good example. Red and green are across from one another on the color wheel, and that's why red and green are so popular and beautiful at Christmas time. They cause each other to seem brighter, and they really pop when they're together. So our orange and our blue look beautiful on our painting today. We're going to move on to step 4, which is the stem and the leaves. So we're going to be using a darker green for the shadow areas. We're going to look for those highlights that Lily was mentioning before. So places where you know that the light is reflecting off the top of a leaf or the edge of a leaf, or any place that you feel like light is reflecting off of the stem and the leaves. That's going to be a lighter, more yellowy green. And then the cooler, darker areas where our shadows fall, that is a bluer or a darker green. So have fun on your palette mixing some lighter green, yellow green, or some darker green, and we're going to be using all of those as we paint our stem and our leaves. Like that? Exactly like that. And Lily and I always love our palettes. We actually save our little palettes.
Because they're so pretty by the end. I like blending the colors, and it's kind of hard when you have colors so close together here. You don't want the wrong colors to bleed together, especially when you're trying to make something really specific like we have here. But you do it
These
right,
are gorgeous.
they end up beautiful.
I think one day I'm going to make a collage out of all of our little palettes.
That's a good idea.
All right, so let's paint our stem and leaves. Okay, as we're finishing up our stems and leaves, and as we go back and finish up the smallest little areas of our petals, I want you to really think about contrast. The lightest areas and the darkest areas, or the lighter pigment of green versus the darker pigment of green. You really want to use contrast. So find those places that are really dark, the darkest shadowed areas, and push the depth of that green. Or in the petals, find the darkest areas of that orange or the shadow on the petals and kind of push that a little deeper. You do want to develop contrast with those colors. That's the last few steps we're working on here, is the darker and the lighter colors.
Okay. Look how beautiful these daffodils turned out to be.
I'm happy.
Me too.
Yep.
In the final touches, I think what really brought mine to life was actually going back with clean water and erasing some of the oversaturated color on the petals. It brought the highlights that I think mine needed.
I agree. And don't forget that erasing she's referring to is really just using a dry or a damp brush that's clean and picking up some of that wet pigment. It works almost like an eraser, and I love it. These are beautiful and so much like spring. Makes me feel happy.
Me too. I'm so thrilled that spring is here and that the weather is warmer and we can focus on these beautiful colors of life.
Awesome. Great job, Lily.
You too, Mama. Thanks for joining us today, and we hope you'll join us next month. And if you're interested in ordering a Robin and Lily paint kit, find us on social media or visit our website, artbarnstudios.com. Thank you.